Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to give my review of WCW Slamboree 1996. Starting off the evening, we'll go to our first match of the night. Is a tag team matchup. It is Road Warrior Animal teaming up with Booker T versus Lex Luger and Road Warrior Hawk. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Lex Luger keeping the pace of the match. Lex then hits a power slam. Animal then hits a power slam of his own on Lex Luger. An all-out brawl takes place in the ring. The referee then sounds for the bell, and this match ends up ending in a double countout. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Public Enemy versus the Taskmaster and Chris Benoit. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Public Enemy keeping the pace of the match. Rocco Rock ends up hitting a senton over the ropes on Benoit through a table. Pins for the 3. And your winners of the match are Public Enemy. Hats off to the Public Enemy for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Rick Steiner teaming up with Brutus the Barber versus Sergeant Craig Pittman and Scott Steiner. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Scott hitting a power bomb in the middle of the ring. Rick then hits a power slam on Pittman. Pittman then applies a code red on Brutus. But Rick Steiner ultimately hits a German suplex, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Rick Steiner and Brutus the Barber. Hats off to Rick Steiner and Brutus the Barber for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Hacksaw Jim Duggan and Wall Street versus Dave Taylor and Steven Regal. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Jim Duggan keeping the pace of the match. Regal and Wall Street both exchange in the middle of the ring with Duggan attacking Wall Street. Duggan ultimately hits the finish, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Hacksaw Jim Duggan and Wall Street. Hats off to Hacksaw Jim Duggan and Wall Street for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Alex Wright teaming up with Disco Inferno versus Robert Eaton and Dick Slater. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Alex Wright landing multiple European uppercuts on Eaton. Slater then hits Disco with a boot. Referee doesn't see it. Pins for the 3. And your winners of the match are Robert Eaton and Dick Slater. Hats off to Robert Eaton and Dick Slater for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Hugh Morris teaming up with Ming versus Diamond Dallas Page and Barbarian. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams with DDP and the Barbarian keeping the pace of the match. Hugh Morris then hits an elbow drop off the top rope. Hugh Morris then hits a moonsault off the top rope as well. Barbarian, though, ultimately hits the finish on Hugh Morris. Barbarian then goes for the cover. DDP then also, it was like a weird transaction that was going on in this matchup because you had Barbarian go for the cover as well, and then Ming also went for the cover. DDP's foot was under the ropes. Referee then sounded for the bell, and your winners of the match were DDP and the Barbarian due to the fact that DDP's foot was underneath the ropes during the pinfall. So hats off to DDP and Barbarian for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Fire and Ice versus Bubba and Stevie Ray. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Fire and Ice keeping the pace of the match. Fire and Ice ultimately hit the finish on Big Bubba, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Fire and Ice. Hats off to Fire and Ice for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Eddie Guerrero teaming up with Arn Anderson versus the Nature Boy Ric Flair and Macho Man Randy Savage. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth match between both teams. Ric Flair ends up attacking Randy Savage. Eddie and Flair both exchange in the middle of the ring with Arn hitting a spine buster on Randy for a near fall. Eddie then lands chops on Flair. Arn then hits a DDT on Eddie in the middle of the ring. Flair then goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Ric Flair and Macho Man Randy Savage. Hats off to Ric Flair and Randy Savage for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It is Dean Malenko defending the Cruiserweight Championship against Brad Armstrong. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Malenko and Armstrong, with Armstrong hitting an enziguri on Malenko. Malenko was keeping the pace of the match, though, with Malenko working on the legs of Brad Armstrong. Armstrong then hits a power slam on Dean. Armstrong then applies the cloverleaf on Dean, but Dean quickly breaks the hold. Malenko then ultimately hits the finish on Brad Armstrong, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time still WCW Cruiserweight Champion, is Dean Malenko. Hats off to Dean Malenko for getting the win in that match. Moving on from that, we're going to our next match of the night. It is Hacksaw Jim Duggan and Wall Street versus Robert Eaton and Dick Slater. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Duggan attacking Wall Street once again. Duggan then was keeping the pace of the match. Wall Street then hits Duggan. Duggan then goes to hit Wall Street. Eaton goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Robert Eaton and Dick Slater. Hats off to Robert Eaton and Dick Slater for getting a win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Public Enemy versus Ric Flair and Randy Savage. Randy then attacks Ric Flair, with Flair coming down to the ring. Wrestlers then from the back come out to break up the fight between Randy and Flair. And Public Enemy ultimately get the win in this matchup due to a forfeit from Ric Flair and Randy Savage. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Rick Steiner and Brutus the Barber versus DDP and Barbarian. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with DDP and Brutus both exchanging in the middle of the ring. Barbarian then hits a powerbomb on Rick Steiner for a near fall. DDP was keeping the pace of the match, though. Brutus hits a high knee. DDP then ultimately hits an elbow drop on Brutus, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are DDP and the Barbarian. Hats off to DDP and the Barbarian for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW United States Heavyweight Championship. It is Jushin Thunder Liger versus Conan. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Liger and Conan, with Liger keeping the pace of the match. Liger ends up hitting a devastating brainbuster on Conan in the middle of the ring. Liger then hits a senton on Conan in the corner. Liger then ultimately hits a fisherman suplex for a near fall on Conan. Jushin Thunder Liger then hits a Liger bomb on Conan as well, but Conan ultimately hits a power drop on Jushin Thunder Liger, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time still WCW United States Heavyweight Champion, is Conan. Hats off to Conan for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a Battle Royal matchup. It is Scott Norton versus Ice Train versus Dick Slater versus Robert Eaton versus Public Enemy versus DDP versus the Barbarian. The match itself, it was a decent match. Back and forth matchup with everybody involved, with DDP and the Barbarian being the last 2 competitors in the ring. But DDP ultimately hits his signature diamond cutter on the Barbarian, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match is DDP. Hats off to DDP for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of WCW Slamboree 1996. It is the Giant defending the WCW World Heavyweight Championship against Sting. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Giant and Sting, with Giant keeping the pace of the match. Sting hits a step-up enziguri on the Giant. Giant then hits an elbow drop on Sting. Giant then is choking Lex Luger. Sting then hits a Stinger Splash on the Giant in the corner while he was choking Lex Luger. Sting then got hit with a megaphone from Jimmy Hart. Giant then hit a chokeslam on Sting, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time still WCW World Heavyweight Champion, is the Giant. Couple of things I'm going to say about this pay-per-view, man. Slamboree 1996. Number one, was it a good event? No. Slamboree 1996 was not a good event, man. It's definitely one of those events that I'm not going to put on my calendar, that's for sure. With that being said, I think the way that Slamboree was set up, I just wasn't a big fan, because number one, it was almost like they were doing a Battle Bowl kind of predicament throughout the entire night. So you had tag teams, or, tag team partners going up against each other in different tag matches. For like prime example, you got Road Warrior Animal teaming up with Booker T versus Lex Luger and Road Warrior Hawk. I don't like the concept of those kind of matches because it's confusing. And the Battle Bowl thing for me, as far as being a fan, I never really agreed with the Battle Bowl experience with WCW. I just thought it was lackadaisical booking, and it drawn out like a lot of matches, even during the mid card and the beginning of even the beginning of the event. It was too long. It was the same kind of match format that we were getting throughout the entire night with all these tag team matches. It gets lackadaisical, man, if you keep doing all these matches like that throughout the entire night. Some matches on here, though, I'm not going to sit here and say they were bad matches. The Eddie Guerrero, Arn Anderson versus Ric Flair and Randy Savage match was really good, and the way that they were hyping up Eddie Guerrero even then in WCW, absolutely awesome stuff, man. Eddie Guerrero was an absolute legend. Dean Malenko versus Brad Armstrong. This is one of the matches on this card for me that was probably a match of the night, in my honest opinion. The Cruiserweight division was severely underrated for WCW, and I think it was one of the best things WCW had in their arsenal at that time. I mean, the amount of cruiserweights that came through that division, walked through the doors of WCW was absolutely phenomenal stuff, man. I mean, from the likes of Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, Juventud Guerrero, Chris Jericho, that's just to name a few, man, that came through the doors as a cruiserweight. Rey Mysterio Jr., I mean, Rey Mysterio made a career for himself, not just only in Mexico, but as well as WCW. I mean, I think main event exposure for Rey all started in WCW when he was in the Cruiserweight division. I think Rey Mysterio made a huge name for himself over in WCW, as well as ECW as well. But, I mean, let's face facts. ECW wasn't on primetime television. Their pay-per-views weren't being sold out, and they were being sold out. They were in small pay-per-view arenas compared to what Ted Turner and WCW were doing at that time. Not taking anything away from ECW. I think ECW was absolutely awesome and legendary promotion in their own right. There'll never be another ECW ever again. But the Cruiserweight division was severely underrated, man. I mean, even this matchup between Malenko and Armstrong is a fantastic match. And, to me, I'm a big fan of Dean Malenko. Always have been, always will be. But Malenko, I think what he brought to the Cruiserweight division, because you got to understand the Cruiserweight division were a lot of high flyers. You had Chris Jericho, who is a high flyer. Even when he was teaming up with Lance Storm in Smoky Mountain Wrestling as the Thrill Seekers, I mean, they were high flyer wrestlers, number one. Number two, a lot of the cruiserweights were luchadors. A lot of them were high flying type of wrestlers like, a Rey Mysterio, a Psychosis, Juventud Guerrero. They're luchadors, and they're high flying wrestlers, moves off the top rope. And I'm not saying Dean couldn't do the same thing, but the one thing that I'll give Dean is that Dean was a mat wrestler, but his moveset and what he did in that ring, there was nothing that he couldn't handle, number one. And two, he can hang with those luchadors just fine, 100%. The matches that he would have with Ray or Eddie, some of the best matches I've ever seen, man, in my honest opinion. So the Malenko versus Armstrong match was definitely match of the night, in my honest opinion. As well as the main event, Giant versus Sting. I'm not going to sit here and say it was better. Was it better than Dean versus Armstrong? No. I think Dean Malenko and Armstrong was the match of the night on this card, but Giant and Sting wasn't that bad. We also have Jushin Thunder Liger versus Conan, which I think the way that we're hyping it up, I think it was Mike Tenay on commentary with Tony Schiavone. It was kind of like a first-time matchup for Liger versus Conan. And it was a decent match, but I mean, at the end of the day, Liger is a legend. And Conan, I mean, for what it's worth, man, Conan really did a good job in WCW. He really did. And I mean, him teaming up with, the NWO Black and Red brand, the Wolfpack, it definitely, got some more insight on Conan's career. But, he did a fantastic job carrying that WCW United States Championship, no doubt. I mean, Conan severely underrated as well. I mean, the finish that he had, the Tequila Sunrise, was a good finish. But I think Conan was severely underrated throughout his career, to be honest with you. I think he has a great mind for the business, in my honest opinion. But all in all, man, I think Dean Malenko versus Brad Armstrong was the match of the night for me for Slamboree 1996. With that being said, man, I mean, with the lackadaisical card, and like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of 10. Slamboree for me was a swing and a miss, man. I'm going to have to give Slamboree 1996 a solid 3, maybe 3.5 at best. But this is my review of WCW Slamboree 1996. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.